What's up, everyone? Payload CMS comes with some great storage adapters right out of the box, but none of those storage adapters come with built-in image optimization. In order to optimize images then, you would need to roll your own optimization, or if you're building in Next.js like I am, you might use the image component to optimize your images. Creating your own optimization can be complicated, and if you're deploying on Vercel, using the image component can add to your implementation costs. That's where Cloudinary can help. There's no official Payload CMS built plugin for Cloudinary though, but you can still use Cloudinary's powerful transformations, CDN, caching, and all of that using my new plugin, Payload Storage Cloudinary. In this video, I'll go over the installation and configuration you need in order to link your Payload CMS to Cloudinary. And since Cloudinary handles all the optimization, the caching, the transformations, and all of that for you, you won't need to use the Next.js Image component. And you certainly won't have to roll your own optimization. If you want the code I use in this video, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. To get started, you'll need 3 things from your Cloudinary account. All 3 can be found in the API keys section of your settings and are available to all plans, free and paid alike. The first is the cloud name, which you can find at the top of the API keys section of your settings. You'll also need to generate a new API key if you don't have one already. You can do that by clicking Generate New API Key and following the instructions from the prompts that follow. Once you do that, you'll see an API key and API secret, which you can copy along with your cloud name and paste them in your environment variables as Cloudinary cloud name, Cloudinary API key, and Cloudinary API secret. Once you have these in place, you can install my package by running npm add payload storage Cloudinary. With installation out of the way, we can get this initialized in our payload config. So I will go over to our payloadconfig.ts file, and I'm going to, at the top of the file, import Cloudinary storage from payload storage Cloudinary. And now we can go down to our plugins, and at the top of our plugins array, I'll add our Cloudinary storage and add our cloud config, and then just pass in the cloud name, which will be my environment variable for Cloudinary cloud name, then the API key, which will be the environment variable, Cloudinary API key, and finally our API secret, which will be the environment variable, Cloudinary API secret. Now to get started, I need to add the collections that I'd like to use this plugin for. So I will pass in the documents media slug, which is a collection that we made a long time ago. Now we'll want to go to our document.ts file, and in our upload option here, disable local storage, since storage will now be handled by Cloudinary. I'm going to get rid of all of the optional options I've got here, but this should work just the same as all other media collections where you can have as much as you want in that collection. And that's all there is to it for the basic setup. I can go over to my Cloudinary account, and once I'm logged in, I will spin up my development server and go to my documents collection. Now in my documents collection, I can create a new document, so I'll select a file and upload that file, and I can add just an alt text here and hit save. And once that submits, I'll be able to, in my root folder, see that document upload here to Cloudinary. You have several options on how you can render this image on the front end. We'll go over some of the more advanced features later on, but for now, we're going to set up our page config by going to our pages config.ts file, and we're going to add a new field at the top of our fields array that will just be document, and then this will have a type of upload and a relation to our documents collection. Now I can save that and then generate our types. And now I can again run my development server, refresh the admin UI, and now I can go to my pages, and we'll just go to the home page. And I can choose from an existing document and publish this for this locale. Now we'll go to our page.tsx file for our locale slug page.tsx. And we are going to import type document from our payload types. And then below our constant of page here, we're going to get our document in a constant, and we'll pull out the page document and cast it as the document type we just imported. We can then comment out some of the stuff that we're not going to use here in the return statement and bring up the H1. And then below the H1, we're just going to use a standard image HTML tag where we'll get the source from the document URL, our alt from the document alt text, our height will be from our document height, and then our width will be document width. And we're going to have some fallback values here of 640 and 360. Since we have to have our source and our document.url should never be undefined, we are going to use a non-null assertion there. Now let's clean this up, make it look a little bit better. And you'll notice that my IDE is giving me a warning here. That's because I need to disable my linter from checking for no image elements in my files. Once I do that, it's disabling it for the next line, which is the image element here. Now that that's done, let's go to our home page. And once that refreshes, we see the image right here on our home page. Obviously, you can style this however you want, and soon we'll go over different transformations you can apply to images straight from Payload CMS. But first, there are several more options available to you in your Cloudinary adapter. The first is folders. If you don't want to upload everything to your root folder, you can define a folder using the folders option. So I'm going to show that off by going to our payload config again. And instead of just having documents set to true, I can open this up to be an object. Then I'm going to pass in a folder, and I'm going to have it default to payload documents. Taking this a step further, you're able to configure the folder setup however you would like to. To do this, you can replace this folder path with another object. And so here we can put our path to be payload documents. And then we want to enable this to be a dynamic field. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow the editor to type in the different folders. Then we can set a field name, so we can have Cloudinary folder, which is the default name, but we can set it explicitly here. And so we can see what this looks like by going to our documents collection. And now we see we have a Cloudinary folder field here. And here I'm able to add more to the folder path if I'd like to, but I don't. We're also able to see the original URL that we can use on the front end if we would like to. And this does not include any transformations, so it should just be the standard image as you see it and as it was uploaded. Now we also have the option to skip the field creation altogether, and I'm going to set this to true because I want to create a custom component to handle our folders for us. But before we get to that, if you have enable dynamic set to true, what this will do is if you change your folder path, it will automatically move the image from folder to the new location without duplicating the image for you. Now, if you want the option to select a folder that you've already created in Cloudinary, you are able to do that. First, you do need to set skip field creation to true, and then we're going to create a custom select component that's going to get our Cloudinary folders and render them in our select field as options. So first, we're going to come over to our project and we're going to go down to our components. And I'm going to create a new directory and call it Cloudinary. And in this, I'm going to create a new file called field.client.tsx. And this is going to be a client component, which will import our field label from Payload CMS UI, the select input, as well as the text input and the use field hook. We'll also import the type of option object from payload and React as well as use state from React. Now we're going to export a constant called field client, which will take an arrow function. For props, we'll pass in folders, which will have the type of option object as an array. We'll call use field here with no path, and we're going to destructure the use field hook, where we're going to take out path, value, and set value. Then we'll use a use state hook, which will set and get our folder mode. The use state will only accept existing or new as types, and it'll default to existing. Now we can return our field by passing in a div, and I'm just going to use inline styles for simplicity because I'm just trying to design a new field. And we're going to have this be a flex direction of column, and a gap of 1 rem. Then within this div, we'll have our field label, which will take a label and a path of path. And then underneath the field label, we'll have another div. We'll style this one to be display flex, a gap of 1 rem, and then a margin bottom of 0.5 rem. Then within this div, we'll have a label, and this label will have styles for display flex, align items, center, gap of 0.5 rem, and then a cursor pointer. And then we need our input element, which will have type of radio. Then we'll have the checked attribute, which will check if folder mode is set to existing, which will then default it to be checked there. And then on change, we'll set our folder mode to existing. Then we'll have our value set to existing. And then finally, we're going to pass in a name attribute where we'll have our path mode. Now we can put in our label text, which is select existing folder. Now we're just going to copy this and paste it below this label. We're going to change folder mode to be new, as well as value and on change to set the folder mode to new as well. Instead of existing folder, we can say create new folder. Now, underneath this div, we need to check if folder mode is existing. And if it is, we can set our select input, which will have a path of path, a name of path, value of the value as string. Then we'll need our options, which will be our folders, and then we'll have an onChange attribute that gets the event, which we'll just set to be any, and have it set value based on our event value. Otherwise, we can pass in our text input, which will have a path of path, a value of value as string. We then need a placeholder, which will tell the editor to enter a folder path, and we'll give an example of payload uploads. Then we need our onChange, which will take the event of type any and set the value based on the event's value. Then we can close our text input, and we should be good to go here. Next up, we need to set up the server side of this. So we'll go back to our Cloudinary folder and add a new file, and we'll just call this one field.tsx. And we'll import get Cloudinary folders from the plugin. Then from our field client, we'll import field client. Then we can export an async function called select field with no props. And we'll await get Cloudinary folders and store those folders in a constant called folders. And then we can return our field client with the folders that we get from get Cloudinary folders. Now, one quick note about get Cloudinary folders. This value is cached for 5 minutes to reduce API calls. Now, with our field done, we can go to our document.ts and we're going to add in this custom field. We can do that by adding a name, which we'll just call this Cloudinary folders. This will be a type of text. Then we can add our admin option with our components prop, where we'll get our field, and we'll pass in a path that will be our source components Cloudinary field.tsx and the export name being select field. Then we can generate an import map and run our development server, refresh our documents collection. And we can see here now I've got my Cloudinary folders. I can create a new folder, or I can select an existing folder by scrolling through this select field. You have the ability to control how files are deleted or retained in Cloudinary through the plugin. By default, the plugin will delete any image that you delete from Payload in Cloudinary as well. You can change this behavior by going back to our configuration. And in our collections, underneath our folder prop here, we can pass in delete from Cloudinary, and default is true, but if we don't want to delete the files, we can set that to false. I personally want my files to be deleted when they're deleted from Payload, so I'll leave this set to true. The next option is upload queues. Now, upload queues really only apply to those with paid plans. Since Cloudinary limits the free plan to 10 megabytes per image and up to 100 megabytes per video, you may not need to set up upload queue. However, if you do have large files to upload, know that you can do that through this plugin by setting up the upload queue options. So in here, you can set enabled to true. You can have a max concurrent uploads to whatever number you want it to be. Then you can enable your chunked uploads by setting that to true, and then setting your chunk size to the number in megabytes. Then we have the large file threshold, where you want to set the threshold of what a large file is. So these two fields, chunk size and large file threshold, are both megabyte values. Since I'm just operating on the free plan though, I can comment this out so it remains in the repo, but inactive in my plugin. Before we talk about transformations using this Cloudinary plugin, check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release content about Payload CMS, Next.js, Tailwind CSS, and more. Consider subscribing to my newsletter so you can stay up to date with not just the videos I put out, but all the news from across the internet about all the key technologies that you use. Think things like Vercel, Next.js, Payload CMS, Tailwind CSS, Railway, and more. The link to that newsletter is in the description of this video. Now let's get back to it with Cloudinary transformations. Transformations are one of the key features of Cloudinary, so I had to make sure to include it in this plugin as well. In fact, it's the main reason that many people choose to use Cloudinary, not just for their caching or their CDN, but for the transformations that are available in Cloudinary. By default, no transformations are applied to your uploads, but you can easily implement it by setting your transformations object. In here, you'll want to set your default to whatever you want your default upload to be. So I'm just going to set quality to be auto, and my fetch format to also be auto. And now these are familiar to those who use Cloudinary, so other options are available as well, depending on what you want to use from the Cloudinary API. All of that is available to you in this plugin. We can also set our presets to be whatever we want, but I did export some common presets. So we'll import those from the package, and then we'll enable our preset selection to true. And then I want to preserve the original image, so I'll set that to true as well. Now I can save this and refresh. And now we can see down here the transformations preset select field, where we can choose from different sizes, different locations we want to save this, the aspect ratio, effects, as well as optimization. You can, of course, add to these transformation presets or just write your own instead of using the common presets. By changing common presets to an array, we'll use the spread operator to keep the common presets, but again, you don't need to do that. And then we can just pass in some objects of presets. So I might want a product hero where I'll do a label of product hero, then apply the transformations I want, which would be, we'll say 1920, a height of not 1080, but of 800. We'll set a crop of fill, gravity of auto, and then quality of auto, and we'll get the best quality we can. We can then also add something like pixelate, which is one of the defaults, but so you can see how this works. We will have our pixelated name with a label of pixelated, and then a transformation with the effect of pixelate 20. So now when I save this, we should be able to see these show up at the bottom of our select list here. Now you can select more than one, but if you select two of the same category, the only one that'll be applied is the most recent, and that is the limitation of Cloudinary's API, not necessarily of the plugin. When you upload a file, Cloudinary stores a few fields for you. Those fields are URL, thumbnail URL for your admin UI, the Cloudinary public ID, Cloudinary version for the API call, and transformation preset if enabled. As I mentioned earlier, you have several options to display images stored in Cloudinary on your front end. Let's get started by applying transformations to these images. So first, we're going to go over to our page.tsx file in our slug dynamic route. Then in our image, we can simply add, for the source, our transformed URL. So I don't think we set a transformation, so I'm going to do that and set it to be pixelate, and we can hit save. And you can see this transformed URL gets populated, and then on the front end, we can now see the pixelated version of the image. Now, if I wanted it to be the hero image instead, I can hit save and refresh, and now I can see it as a hero image instead. Now, if we wanted to define a transformation on the front end on the fly, we can use the get transformation URL helper function from the storage plugin and pass in the public ID, which will come from the document and will never be null. Then we'll need the version, which will be the same thing, Cloudinary version, never null. Then we'll set a preset name to be pixelated. And then we can set our presets in an array and set our name to match the preset name we used above with a label of pixelated as well. And the transformations where we'll pass in an effect, pixelate, and we'll say 3000. Now we can set our source here to be pixelated instead. And when I refresh, we'll see a very pixelated image instead of what we had from Payload CMS. Now, one other way to implement transformations on the front end is to directly manipulate the URL. So we can do that by first setting a function called getTransformed URL, where we'll pass in the original URL as a string, and we'll pass in our transformations as well as a string. We can set our constant called parts to split our original URL by the upload string, and then we can return those parts, re-add upload, apply transformations, and then add more parts. So this is just splitting up our URL, so we're able to add the transformations where Cloudinary expects them. Then we can create a function called responsive image, just as an example. And we will have our document, which will be of type document. And we'll set our constant of widths to be 320, 640, 1024, and 1920. Then we'll set a source set that equal to our widths. We're going to map through those widths. And for each width, we will get our transformed URL, and then we'll pass in our doc URL, and then the string that Cloudinary uses for their transformations, which will be a string that looks like this, where we'll also add a quality of auto, and then f auto as well. And then a fallback of width w, and then we can join it all together with a comma and some white space. Now we can return our image, which will get our source, which is going to be our get transformed URL, doc URL, then the string of transformations we want, which will have, again, q auto, f auto, then our source set, which will be the source set we set, and then our sizes will also have set as max width of 640 pixels. Wrap this in parentheses and set it to be 100 view width, then max width 1024 pixels, and set that to be 50% of the view width, and then finally 33% of the view width. And then we need our alt, which will just be our doc alt. And then, of course, the URL cannot be undefined, and this function actually doesn't need to be a React functional component. And one last type error here, doc URL cannot be undefined. So now I can return this responsive image as a component. So we'll have responsive image, and we just need our document passed in, and I can save that. And now we can see at larger screen sizes, it's taking up 50% of the view width. And then at smaller screen sizes, 100%. And then finally, 33% at larger screen sizes. Signed URLs are also available out of the box with this plugin, so we can go back to our payload config and enable these and see what they look like. So in our documents, we can add the private files option and just set it equal to true. And then we can see what that looks like on the back end here, where I just see private file with the default being set to true. Now, just setting private files to true is enough to get started, but there are more options available to you by opening up the private files options and setting enabled to true. You can change how long the expiry lasts, so I can set it to be something like 2 hours, and this is in seconds. And then we can set the auth types, which come from Cloudinary. So these are the auth types that Cloudinary provides, and then we can decide to include transformations or not. You can even add some custom access logic by adding the custom auth check and then passing in a function where we can get the request and the document, and then we can return something like the request user as a Boolean. And so this will enable it for any authenticated user. Now, just doing this is not going to be enough to set you up for private files. What you need to do as well is go to your document.ts, and you want your read access to be set to true. We're going to handle the signed URLs using a hook. So beneath our access, I'm going to add our hooks option, and we're going to add an after read hook, which is going to take our document and our request, and we'll do some logic to it. We'll check first if our doc requires a signed URL or is private and there is no request user. If this is the case, I'm just going to return null. Otherwise, we can return the document. Now, what this is saying is that if the document requires a signed URL or the document is private and there is no user, then don't return anything. Otherwise, you can return the document. With private files enabled, you'll need a way to render these files. The plugin provides several options for you to do this, including examples and different methods, so be sure to check out the documentation when you get a chance. For this example, though, we're going to use a client component to do this. Let's create a new directory in our Cloudinary folder that we'll call protected image. And in this directory, we're going to add a new file called index.tsx. This file will need interactivity, so again, it'll be a client component. We'll use client, and we'll import React, use state, and use effect from React. We'll import fetched signed URL and requires signed URL from the plugin, specifically from the client side. And then we're going to import type collection slug from payload. We can then export a function called protected image, and we'll pass in a document and a collection with the default being set to documents. For simplicity, we're going to set our doc to be any type, and our collection will be a collection slug. We'll start with a useState hook to set and get our image URL. It'll be default null, and we'll only accept string and null values. Then we need another useState hook that will set and get our loading status, and this will be false. And then one last useState hook to set and get our error status, which will be of type error or a null value, with the default being null. I want this to run on every render, so I'll set useEffect, and we are going to pass in our doc and our collection as dependencies. And now we can build out the callback function here by setting an async function called load image. And in this, we're going to check first if it does not require a signed URL, and we'll check that for the doc. We'll set the image URL to be doc URL, and then just return to break the function. After that, we can set loading to true. Now I can try to await our fetched signed URL, which will take our collection and check against our doc ID. And we can store this as our URL constant and then set our image to that URL constant. Then we can try to catch our error, which we'll set as E, and then set the error as E as the error type. And then finally, we can set our loading status to false. And then below all of that, we can call our load image function in the useEffect hook. If we're in a loading state, we can return a div that just says loading. If there's an error, it's because the person is not authorized to view the content. And then if there is no image URL, there is a different error, and we'll just say that there's no image. Finally, we can return an image with the source of image URL and set our alt text to be our doc alt. And now, of course, we'll need to tell our linter to suppress this line. We then need to import this into the page.tsx file, so I'll do that. Remove responsive image and add protected image. Pass in our document just the same and our collection of documents. And now I can save this. Now to test this out, let's create a new file, which I will just take this JPEG and set the alt value to test, and we will select our payload uploads file, and I'll select my payload uploads folder, and we'll make this be grayscale by going to effects grayscale, and I can hit save. And now that we hit save, I can see that the original URL is authenticated. So let's go over to our pages collection and change this out of our top slot here. So we'll choose from existing, and we'll set this, and we'll publish it. Then when I hit refresh on the home page, and now since we're logged in, I can see this image here. But if I come over to the admin UI and log out, I'm no longer authorized to see this content. One great use case for this plugin is to create an obscured version of your upload. What this does is it'll add a watermark or a blur to your image so that those who are not authorized to see your images can still see a preview of it without seeing the original image. With this plugin, you can generate preview files for your premium content. For example, a photographer might want to add their watermark to an image for a client to preview before purchasing the image. And this plugin makes that possible. To do this, you will need to go to your payload config file, and we're going to add the public transformation option above our private files. In public transformation, I will set enabled to true. We'll set a field name to be enable public preview. Then we will set the type field name to be transformation type. Then we'll include our watermark, which will have the text field name of watermark text. And I'll set my default text to be NLV codes as an example. Then we can style our watermark how we want. So I'll use a font family of Verdana with a font size of 50. We will use font weight of bold, letter spacing 15, color, not white, but RGB 80/80/80, then an opacity of 50. This needs to be a percentage, so we'll do 50%. Then we'll angle it at a 45-degree angle, and we'll position this at the center. You can also create a blurred option where we'll set an effect of blur 2000, a quality of 30 to diminish the quality even further, and then a width of 600 and a height of 600. All of these values are, of course, customizable. So now we'll log back in and we can go to our documents. And now we can see we have enable public preview. And if I check that, I can choose between a watermark that says preview. I can change this to be NLV codes. And then I can save this. And now I'm ready to render this. So we're going to await get premium image URL, and we're going to pass in our document as well as our payload object, the collection of documents. We'll check is authenticated from our user, and then we'll include our transformations, and we can destructure this to be our URL and is preview options. And that way we can, underneath our protected image, we can add a new image that has a source of URL, then an alt of document, alt, of course, and then a style. We'll set this to be a responsive size, so width of 100%, height of auto. We'll clear this warning by suppressing our linter. And then maybe we want to include is preview, and we can include a div that says upgrade to view this image. So now I can save this, come on over to our homepage, and I'm logged in, so I see the image, no problem. But now if I log out and refresh, I can now see a watermarked value here instead, and it says upgrade to view this image. Now we can log back in. I can go to my documents and change this to be instead a blurred image. I can log out and then refresh. And we can see a very blurred version of the image with still upgrade to view this image. There's so much more you can do with this plugin with more configuration. If you're interested in using this plugin, you can find it at npmjs.com. There's a link in the description below. All the documentation is there with complete examples. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I post more content about Payload CMS, Next.js, Tailwind CSS, and more. Again, tired of trying to keep up with all of the industry news and web dev? Subscribe to my newsletter, which will send bi-weekly updates of all the industry news you could ever want. Think Payload CMS, Tailwind CSS, Next.js, Vercel, and more. The link to that, again, is in the description. Consider becoming a paying member of my channel as well so you can access new videos earlier than the general public. If you have comments or suggestions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.